The young man stepped into the crowded terminal, his steps slow and deliberate, the buzz of conversations, and the sound of rolling suitcases faded into the background, his focus unshakable. But there was something unsettling about the way he moved. No bags, nothing to carry, not even a jacket, just the single ticket, clutched tightly in his hand, a thin strip of paper that seemed to be the only thing tying him to this moment. Everything else in his life had been left behind. He walked past the gates without a glance, and the flight attendants didn't miss him. The way he stood apart from the crowd, his face wasn't unfamiliar to them. He was just like every other traveler on the surface, but something about him caught her eye, something subtle, in the way his shoulders were hunched slightly, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. The woman smiled politely at each passenger as they passed through, but when her gaze landed on him, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about him. The flight was delayed, so she found herself standing at the gate, occasionally looking over at him. He hadn't moved since he arrived, still standing by the window, gazing out at the planes coming and going. She watched him. For a moment longer, curiosity gnawing at her mind. What was this young man doing here alone with no bags? Was he lost? Or was he running from something? Was he just forgetful? Or was there a deeper reason for his emptiness? She approached him slowly, making sure to give him space, not wanting to intrude too much. But the silence between them was growing heavy, and she couldn't ignore the pull of something that felt so out of place. Her voice broke through the quiet as she asked him if he was ready to board. The man's eyes shifted slightly as he turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Yes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but there was something in the way he spoke, a hesitation, as though he had to think about it for a second too long. She smiled and offered a gentle reminder about checking in his bags, but he simply shook his head without saying another word. His answer was final, and yet the flight attendant couldn't help but wonder why he had no luggage for such a long flight. She asked him softly, "Do you need help with anything, sir? Are you sure you don't have any bags?" Her words hung in the air, the silence growing thick between them. He looked at her for a moment before his gaze dropped to the floor, as if the question itself had made him uncomfortable. The young man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and for the briefest moment she could see a flicker of something in his eyes, pain perhaps, or regret, a deep sadness that wasn't immediately obvious but was undeniable. The man finally spoke, after what felt like an eternity of silence, his voice barely audible. "I don't need anything," he said, the words sounding almost mechanical, as if he had practiced them before. "I'm just traveling." His eyes didn't meet hers. Instead, they remained fixed on the ground. But there was something in his tone, something she couldn't quite place, that made her stop and reconsider her next question. The flight attendant's instincts kicked in. She could tell there was more to his story than what he was willing to share yet. The flight attendant stood there watching him, trying to read his face, trying to find a sign that would explain why a young man would board a plane with nothing but a ticket and a quiet air of uncertainty. He shifted again, his hands gripping the edge of the seat in front of him, but he didn't seem to notice the tension his body carried, as though it was all part of some heavy weight he was learning to live with. But she couldn't stop herself. She had to ask again. Something inside her knew that this was more than just a simple oversight. She cleared her throat and spoke softly, as if afraid that even the gentlest words might cause him to pull away again. "I'm sorry, but if you don't mind me asking, it's just unusual for someone to travel without anything. Are you sure everything's all right?" Her voice was calm, but there was a softness there, an unspoken understanding that she hoped would let him open up. But his eyes remained downcast, his face still as unreadable as before. The silence between them thickened, and she could almost hear his thoughts. He was grappling with something deep, something he wasn't ready to share. But the flight attendant had been working in airports long enough to know that sometimes the most quiet people held the loudest stories. It was in his hesitation that she saw the flicker of something deeper, something painful hiding beneath the surface. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, But this time his voice was heavier. There was a weariness in it, a kind of tiredness that even his young face couldn't hide. "It's just," he started, then trailed off, like he was trying to find the words, like the weight of them was too much to bear. All at once he took a breath, and then said, "I'm not running away, I'm just going to say goodbye." The words seemed to hang in the air, as if they were fragile, too fragile to touch, and yet they couldn't help but break through. She waited for him to continue, but he did not immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, looking out the window at the plains, as if he needed a moment to gather himself, before revealing more of the story that was clearly too painful to speak about, too raw to just say out loud. But the flight attendant could feel the tension in him, the kind of emotional pull that made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. She asked again, this time gently, and without pushing, "I'm so sorry, but where are you going, if you don't mind me asking?" Her words were an attempt to guide him, to open up, not to pressure him, but to show him that she was there to listen whenever he was ready to speak. But he didn't look at her as he answered. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the window, his voice soft, but the words were like a quiet storm. "I'm going to my father's funeral." The words dropped like stones into the quiet between them, and the weight of them settled heavily in the space around them like a cold shadow that couldn't be shaken. Her heart clenched at the rawness of his admission, the suddenness of it taking her by surprise. But she didn't look away. Instead, she stayed there waiting for him to say more, to let the story unfold on its own terms, as if his pain was something that could be understood only if given time to breathe. He looked down at his hands as if ashamed of the words he had just said, but there was no shame in them, not in her eyes. No, she could see it now, the quiet grief that lingered just beneath the surface, the kind of grief that didn't need to be loud to be heard. It was a silence that spoke louder than anything else ever could. The words hung in the air like an unspoken truth, one that neither of them had expected to face in this sterile airport terminal. The flight attendant stood there, stunned, her mind racing to process what he had just revealed, his father's funeral. It was such a heavy thing to carry so quietly, and without fanfare. She wanted to say something comforting, but she didn't know how to ease the kind of pain that was seeping from him in waves. His eyes still didn't meet hers, but the rawness of his voice was enough to tell her everything she needed to know about the weight he was bearing. She wanted to offer him words of comfort, but it felt too small, too insignificant in comparison to what he was going through. Instead, she found herself standing there, unsure of what to do with the silence that had taken over them. Both the hum of the airport seemed distant now, irrelevant to the moment they shared. She glanced around at the crowd of people rushing past, oblivious to the quiet grief between them. He seemed to shrink in his seat, as if the words he had spoken had taken even more out of him than he realized. She could see it now, the way his shoulders slumped and his hands trembled slightly, his body language revealing the depth of his exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional, a kind of tiredness that went far beyond what a single night of sleep could fix. After a long pause, he finally spoke again, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried an immense weight. "I didn't even get to say goodbye," his voice cracked, and she could hear the pain there, the deep sorrow that he had been holding inside for who knew how long. It was a kind of grief that didn't make sense. It wasn't the kind of loss you could explain away with words or try to reason with the universe about. It was just an empty hole that nothing could fill. She could see the man's face twitch slightly, as if the memories were coming back to him in flashes, the memories of his father, the moments they shared before the illness took over, the slow toll it had taken on his family, the long months of helplessness. She knew the kind of toll illness could take on someone. It wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional too, and there he was sitting in front of her, carrying all of it on his own. "I was there at the hospital every day." He continued, his voice a little stronger now, but still raw. "But the last time I saw him, he couldn't even recognize me. He was so far gone, so far from the person I knew, and I didn't get the chance to tell him I loved him before he He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, as if saying it out loud would make it too real. The flight attendant's heart ached for him. She could feel the heaviness, in his words the guilt, the regret, the pain of something unsaid, and she couldn't help but wonder what he had been carrying all this time, what had been eating at him. The thought that he had never been able to say goodbye, she wished she could take it away for him. But she knew that wasn't possible, not here, not now. Instead, she reached out and gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a small gesture, but one that she hoped would offer some comfort in the silence. It was all she could offer, but somehow she felt that it was enough in that moment. They didn't need words to understand each other. The sadness in his eyes said it all. The man sat there frozen, as if her touch had momentarily grounded him back into the reality of the airport terminal. The bustling world around them seemed miles away in that moment. The hum of the overhead speakers, the clattering of suitcases, all seemed so distant when compared to the quiet storm he was navigating inside himself. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, and she wondered how long he had been carrying it. His shoulders seemed to slump even further, and she could see the faintest shimmer of tears beginning to gather in his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away as though he were trying to keep his emotions in check, as if letting go would somehow make it all too much for him to bear. It was a look she had seen before, people trying to hold themselves together in the face of loss, in the face of something too big to process. All at once it was the kind of pain that had no easy way to express itself, and yet it was louder than any words could ever be. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there offering him the space he needed to find his own voice. She could feel the silence between them. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding. A silent bond formed between them without either of them saying a word. And in that space she could see the walls around him slowly start to crack. After what seemed like an eternity, he exhaled deeply, and his voice came out shaky, but quieter this time, as though he were speaking to himself more than to her. "I watched him fight for so long," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could be strong for him. But when it happened, when I lost him, I felt like I lost a part of myself too." His eyes stared ahead, as if he were reliving those final moments, the ones where everything had changed so suddenly, so unfairly. She wanted to say something, anything, to offer him a sense of peace, but no words seemed adequate. How do you comfort someone who is experiencing a loss, that deep a loss that had stolen something so precious from them? But she knew what mattered now wasn't the words, it was the listening, the being present with him in this moment. She stayed silent, her hand still resting gently on his shoulder as he let his emotions spill out in fragments. "I wasn't there when it ended," he whispered so quietly she almost missed it. "I thought I could leave for a day, to clear my head, just for a moment, to breathe. And when I came back, he was gone just like that. No goodbye, no final moment, just silence." His voice cracked again, but this time there was no hiding it. The rawness in his tone was impossible to ignore. The flight attendant's chest tightened at the weight of his words. The kind of grief he was carrying was unbearable, and yet he was carrying it alone all the way to this moment, alone in this terminal, with nothing but a plane ticket to take him to the place he dreaded most, to face the finality of it all. For a long moment he was silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if searching for something to hold on to, something to help him make sense of the storm inside his chest. And in that moment she realized that no matter how many times he told the story, no matter how many people listened, the pain wouldn't go away. It would just become a part of him, a part of his journey that he would have to find a way to carry with him. He sat there, his hands trembling slightly as the words left his lips, and even though the flight attendant could sense the immense weight on his chest, she couldn't help but wonder how much of it he had been holding in. How long had he been carrying the silence with him? How many nights had he spent thinking about his father, about the things he never said, about the moments they never had? She knew that the grief wasn't just a feeling, it was 1,000 tiny pieces of guilt and what-ifs that had settled inside him like a stone. And yet, as she looked at him, she could see a strength in him, a quiet resilience beneath the pain, like he was desperately trying to keep himself from shattering completely. And she admired how, despite the deep sorrow, he was still here, standing on the edge of his past, ready to face what was next, even though it felt like too much for one person to bear. The young man looked up at her for the first time since the conversation had begun, and his eyes were filled with so many emotions, all tangled together: confusion, anger, regret, sadness. But beneath it all was a kind of hopelessness, like he wasn't sure how to move forward, how to take the next step, when the weight of everything felt like it would pull him back down with every breath. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, as if the words were caught somewhere deep inside him, unwilling to come out no matter how hard he tried. And she could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he wanted to explain it all, but wasn't sure how she could see that he had never truly allowed himself to grieve properly, never allowed himself to fall apart in front of anyone else, always holding it in, because he thought it would be easier that way. But here he was sitting in front of her, finally letting himself feel the grief he had pushed down for so long. "I didn't get to say goodbye," he said again, his voice cracking once more, and the words felt like a confession, the kind of thing you never truly say out loud, because you're afraid it will break you. "I was supposed to be there, but I wasn't." He paused and looked down at his shoes, as if ashamed of the truth he had just spoken, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something deeper in his eyes: regret, not just for the things left unsaid, but for the time lost, the time he could never get back. The flight attendant's heart ached for him. She could see now that it wasn't just about his father. It was about everything that had led to this moment. All the years he had spent trying to be strong, trying to hold everything together, only to realize that sometimes strength wasn't about holding it all in, it was about letting yourself feel it even when it hurt. "I was too scared to face it," he admitted, his voice small, now barely above a whisper. "I thought if I didn't go, if I didn't seek him in that state, if I stayed away, maybe it wouldn't be real. Maybe I could pretend like it wasn't happening. But when I came back, he was already gone. And I didn't have the chance to say goodbye." His voice faltered again, and this time she could see the tears in his eyes threatening to fall. But he quickly wiped them away before they could escape, as if showing his emotions in front of her would somehow make it worse. She didn't know what to say. There were no words that could take away his pain, no simple phrase that could heal the wound in his heart. But she knew that the first step in healing was being able to talk about it, even if it wasn't easy, even if it hurt. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion, but also with a deep understanding. She didn't need to say more, because she knew he needed to hear that someone cared, someone understood the weight he was carrying. The young man's gaze drifted back to the window, and for a moment he was somewhere else, somewhere far away, lost in the memories of his father. The airport terminal faded into nothing, and all that remained was a time when things had been simpler, when he was just a son and his father was still there, laughing, sharing stories, even when the world felt uncertain. But now those memories seemed so far out of reach, so distant, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who didn't have to face the brutal reality of loss, the kind that leaves you stranded between what was and what will never be again. He took in a slow breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of everything he had said, and everything he hadn't said yet. There was still more he hadn't been able to let out, more that he wasn't sure how to say, or if he even could, but the words felt so close now, so close to spilling over that it almost hurt to hold them back. "I don't know if I can do this," he murmured, his voice almost lost in the noise around them. "I don't know how to face what's waiting for me at the other end of this flight. I thought I could handle it, but now I'm not so sure." His hands fidgeted nervously in his lap, and she could see the weight of his thoughts pulling him under. The flight attendant didn't rush to respond this time. She simply stayed there, offering him the space to speak freely. She could feel his fear and his hesitation. She could see how deeply the loss had shaken him. And she understood that sometimes all a person needed was someone to listen, no judgments, no advice, just the quiet assurance that they weren't alone in their pain. I keep thinking about how it could have been different. He continued, his voice growing steadier, but still carrying that quiet sorrow. How I could have done more, how I should have been there for him when he needed me the most, but I wasn't. I couldn't bring myself to face it. I thought I had more time, and now time's up. And all I have are these regrets, these empty moments that I'll never get back. His eyes flickered to her for the first time since the conversation began, his gaze soft, but filled with so much emotion, it was almost too much to bear. The flight attendant's heart clenched as she watched him. She could feel the pain in his words, the weight of his regret, but she also saw something else, something she hadn't seen before, a kind of vulnerability that was both raw and beautiful in its honesty. And she knew that he was at a crossroads now. He was standing on the edge of something profound, something that would change him, whether he was ready or not. "It's not your fault," she said quietly, her words simple but sincere. "Sometimes we think we have more time, but we don't, and that's something no one can control." She didn't know if he would believe her, but she felt it was important to say it anyway, because she knew how much guilt could weigh on a person and how hard it was to let go of. He nodded, but didn't say anything else, his thoughts still lost somewhere in the past, in the memories of his father, the moments they shared, and the moments they never would. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding between them, as though they both knew that this moment wasn't about fixing the pain. It was just about acknowledging it, letting it exist, without trying to change it. The flight attendant could see that he wasn't ready to share any more, not yet. But she also knew that something had shifted in him, something had started to loosen in the tight grip of his grief. The first step had been taken, and maybe that was all that mattered right now. The rest would come in its own time, when he was ready to face it. The silence between them stretched, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt like a space where both of them were allowed to just exist side by side. No one pushing for answers, no one trying to rush through the grief that had become a part of him, a part of her. In some quiet way, too, she could see how much it meant to him, that someone cared enough to listen, even without the need to fix things, to offer some magic words that would make the pain disappear, because she knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was not when it came to loss. As the minutes passed, she could sense that he was finally starting to breathe a little easier, the tightness in his shoulders slowly easing, and though the storm in his eyes hadn't fully calmed, there was something softer there now, something less frantic, like he had found a small piece of peace within himself, even if it was just for a moment. And in that moment, she could almost feel his exhaustion, to the kind that went beyond physical fatigue. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from holding so much inside for so long, and finally letting some of it out. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and the low rumble of the engines vibrating beneath them seemed to match the turbulence within him. The journey was about to begin, and there was no turning back now. But for the first time he wasn't holding his breath as tightly, he wasn't clinging to his fear in the same way, and she wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had found a tiny thread of hope somewhere between the hurt and the memories. "Do you ever wonder if things would have turned out differently?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the plane. "If you could go back and change one thing, would you?" His question wasn't just for her, it was for himself too. He was trying to make sense of it all, trying to find a way to justify what had happened, as though if he could just pinpoint that one moment when everything changed, maybe he could undo it, or at least understand why it had to happen the way it did. The flight attendant thought for a moment. Before answering, she had never really considered that question in the same way, but now hearing him ask it made her realize how deeply people could search for meaning in moments that didn't make sense, how desperately they could hold on to the hope that if they could find one reason, one explanation for the pain, it would somehow make it easier to carry. "I think sometimes we wonder about things like that," she said slowly, her voice thoughtful. "We all look back and wish we could change one thing or another, but the truth is we can't. All we can do is keep moving forward and honor what we had with the people we loved, even when we didn't get to say goodbye. Her words were simple, but they felt true. She had said them to herself before she had thought about her own losses and the things she could never change. But she knew the only way to move on was to accept what was and cherish the memories, even when they were all that was left. He didn't respond at first, and she wondered if he had hurt her, if it made any difference at all. But then he gave a small nod, as if he were processing her words, letting them sink in, like they held some kind of unspoken truth he wasn't quite ready to accept, but was starting to understand. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm starting to think maybe that's okay." The words hung in the air, between them like a fragile truth, but it was the most honest thing he had said so far, and in that moment she could see a shift in him, something subtle but important, like he was starting to forgive himself just a little bit. The flight attendant gave him a soft smile, one that said everything she didn't need to say. She didn't have any answers, but she was there with him in this moment, and that was all that mattered. The plane soared higher into the sky, and as it climbed above the clouds, something in the young man seemed to shift even further. It was as if the world outside was a metaphor for his own journey, rising above the pain and the grief, even if just for a moment. He stared out the window once again, his reflection barely visible against the endless blue as he lost himself in the quiet hum of the flight. But this time there was something different in his eyes, a quiet acceptance that hadn't been there before. The flight attendant could see the change. She could see it in the way he sat a little taller, the way his breathing had slowed, and the way his hands no longer trembled as much as before. She had been there for him through a small but important part of his journey, and though she knew she couldn't take away his pain, she also knew that the space they had shared, the small act of simply being there, had meant something. He finally broke the silence again, his voice softer than before, but with a certain finality to it. "I don't think I'll ever forget him. I don't think I'll ever stop missing him. But maybe that's okay too. Maybe it means I loved him more than I even realized." He let out a long breath, like he was letting go of something heavy for the first time. "I think I'm starting to understand that it's okay to not have all the answers, and it's okay to not be okay all the time." His words weren't perfect, but they were real, and they carried a weight that only someone who had walked through the darkness could truly understand. The flight attendant smiled to herself. She had seen so many people board planes with so many different stories, so many different struggles, but this one felt different. There was a sense of resolution in him, now a sense that even though the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, he was no longer carrying it alone. He had come to terms with the fact that grief wasn't something you could outrun. It was something you had to live with and learn from, and she had no doubt that this man would find his way through it, even if the road was long. As the plane began its descent into its destination, the young man finally seemed to find peace in the sound of the engines, slowing down the lights of the city below twinkling in the distance like a new beginning. He looked over at her one last time before they landed, his eyes softer now. There was no longer the same pain that had clouded them before, no longer the same overwhelming weight of guilt and regret. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice still filled with emotion, but now carrying a sense of gratitude too. "Thank you for listening, and for being here when I needed someone." His words weren't something she expected, but they meant more than he could ever know, and she felt a warmth in her chest as she nodded back to him. "You don't have to thank me," she replied softly. "I'm just glad you were able to talk, and I'm glad you're not carrying it alone anymore." Her words were simple, but she knew they were true. He had made it through this moment, and even though the path ahead was still uncertain, he had taken a step forward, and that was more than enough. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, and as the passengers began to gather their things, the young man stood up, and she saw him take one last deep breath. He wasn't the same person who had boarded the plane hours earlier. He had been changed, not by anything she had said, but by the process of opening up, the process of allowing himself to feel the pain instead of burying it. As he walked toward the exit, he gave her one final look, a small but genuine smile on his face, and for the first time in a long time it was a smile that felt real. It wasn't about fixing everything, it wasn't about having all the answers, it was simply about accepting the pain and moving forward with it. And maybe that was the most anyone could do.